The Libyan desert is silent, except for the sound of engines. 30 trucks, 2 tankers, and a handful of escorts crawl north toward Agadir. Their mission is simple: fuel for Rommel's tanks. The night is calm. No aircraft, no artillery, no enemy in sight. The drivers think the desert is their shield. Then flashes on the ridge. Short bursts of gunfire, precise and mechanical. Vickers K guns, aircraft weapons mounted on trucks, tear through canvas and fuel drums. Within moments, the convoy is burning. Flames race across the sand, fuel igniting in blue arcs. No one sees the attackers. When dawn comes, the only evidence is wreckage and tire tracks leading south into a region marked impassable. Pinned to the side of a wrecked lorry are 3 letters, written in soot: SAS. In 1940, the Western Desert became a new kind of battlefield, an ocean of sand stretching from Egypt to Tunisia. There were no front lines, no towns to hold, only supply lines and empty space. Conventional armies struggled, tanks overheated, engines choked on dust. Men were lost as easily as vehicles. The one thing both sides feared more than the enemy was distance. But for a handful of pre-war explorers, scientists and adventurers, distance was opportunity. Among them was Major Ralph Bagnold, a Cambridge-educated scientist who had crossed the Sahara in a Model T Ford before the war. He understood the desert as a living system, its dunes moving like tides, its wind shaping geography. When Italy entered the war and seized Libya, Bagnold offered the British Army something it desperately lacked: expertise. From his knowledge came the Long-Range Desert Group, the LRDG, an elite reconnaissance force built from New Zealanders, Rhodesians and British volunteers. Their trucks were stripped of armour, doors and glass. Everything was redesigned for range and reliability. They navigated with the sun compass, an invention of Bagnold's that relied on the shadow of a rod instead of magnetism, which failed in iron-rich sands. It allowed them to travel hundreds of miles with astonishing accuracy. The LRDG's task was not combat, but intelligence. They observed, recorded, and reported. They mapped uncharted wadis and identified hidden tracks used by Axis convoys. They crossed thousands of miles behind enemy lines, unseen and almost mythic in reputation. In a theatre where divisions could vanish overnight, the LRDG proved that small units with skill and mobility could change the nature of war. Yet their mission had one limitation. They could see the enemy, but they were forbidden to strike him. In Cairo, where the Desert War was coordinated, one restless young officer looked at their success and imagined something new. Observation was not enough. If the enemy could be reached, he could be destroyed. David Stirling was 25 years old, tall, reckless, and impossible to ignore. A Scots Guards officer turned commando. He had been injured in a parachute training accident and was confined to a hospital bed in Cairo. There, with nothing to do but think, he began to study aerial photographs of Axis airfields scattered across Libya. The Luftwaffe's aircraft sat in neat rows, unprotected except by sandbags. They were soft targets, but too deep behind enemy lines for conventional attack. Stirling began sketching an idea in his notebook, a small, mobile force that could penetrate those lines, strike hard, and vanish before the enemy could respond. No large columns, no heavy armour, just a handful of men, explosives, and speed. In August 1941, still limping from his injuries, Stirling took his proposal to headquarters. He bypassed the chain of command, sneaking through the fence into the office of General Ritchie. The general listened, sceptical but intrigued, and gave permission to raise a new unit. It was called L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was a deception. There was no brigade. The British wanted German intelligence to believe that large airborne forces were assembling in North Africa. The reality was a few dozen men and one bold idea. Stirling's volunteers trained in secrecy. They learned to handle explosives, to shoot, to navigate by stars. They studied the LRDG's methods but took them further, planning to be not scouts but raiders. Their mission would be simple to describe and nearly impossible to survive. Travel hundreds of miles through the desert, infiltrate Axis airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground, and escape unseen. They would rely on stealth, timing, and courage rather than numbers or armor. It was a completely new philosophy of warfare. Small, intelligent, surgical. The desert was about to meet its most dangerous inhabitants yet. November 1941. A sandstorm was brewing over Cyrenaica when David Stirling received the order he had been waiting for. The Eighth Army was preparing Operation Crusader, a massive attempt to break Rommel's siege of Tobruk. Stirling's handful of volunteers would be given their first test, Operation Squatter, a night parachute insertion behind the Axis front to destroy aircraft on the ground. The plan was audacious. 5 groups of commandos would drop near Gazala, Tamimi, and other forward airfields, each carrying explosive charges and incendiary bombs. If successful, the raid would cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to respond to the coming Allied offensive. They trained for days in the heat at Kabrit, rehearsing jumps, packing parachutes by hand, testing fuses, memorizing escape routes. Many had never parachuted before. Their rations consisted of tinned bully beef, hard biscuits, and tepid water from jerry cans that reeked of petrol. They painted their faces black, checked their pistols, and climbed aboard RAF Bombays, slow, vulnerable twin-engine transports designed in another era. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, the desert below shimmered in moonlight. For the men inside, it felt less like the beginning of an operation and more like a crossing into the unknown. The storm struck as they neared the coast. Gale-force winds ripped across the sky, throwing the planes off course. Pilots shouted over the roar of engines. Altimeters swung wildly. At Stirling's order, the jump lights turned green. Parachutes burst open into chaos. Men were flung sideways, slammed into the sand, dragged for hundreds of meters before they could release their chutes. Equipment containers smashed or vanished into the darkness. Some men landed directly on barbed wire surrounding Axis positions and were captured instantly. Others were never seen again. By dawn, the survivors gathered in small, scattered groups. Stirling's own landing party counted just a dozen men, half their force gone. Their wireless sets were broken, explosives lost or damaged by the storm. One team tried to reach Gazala airfield on foot, only to find it heavily guarded. Another destroyed a single fuel dump before being forced to retreat. When the survivors finally limped back to Allied lines, only 22 of the original 55 remained. It was, by every conventional measure, a disaster. Yet Stirling refused to call it failure. He analysed every detail of what had gone wrong: the wind speed, the aircraft type, the distribution of weight, the lack of mobility after landing, and reached a single conclusion. The desert was not an enemy. It was a vehicle. Why drop from the sky when you could glide across the dunes? Why risk scattering men in storms when the LRDG had already proved that trucks could go anywhere the map ended? He went to see Major Guy Prendergast, the new commander of the LRDG. The meeting at Kufra was brief but decisive. Prendergast, a cautious man, saw potential in Stirling's plan. The LRDG would provide navigation and transport for the SAS. In return, the SAS would provide firepower for LRDG convoys under threat. It was the perfect alliance, one born of necessity rather than doctrine. Over the following weeks, Stirling's men abandoned parachute drills for driving lessons. They learned how to maintain engines in heat that melted grease, how to wrap rope around tires for traction, how to drive by compass bearing alone. They stripped down their vehicles until only the essentials remained: engine, chassis, water, fuel, guns. Anything that added weight or noise was discarded. They drilled with thermite bombs, learning to place them in engine blocks and wing roots for maximum destruction. They practiced night approaches to mock airfields, moving silently in single file. The discipline was severe. Silence was enforced even in camp. If a spanner dropped, heads turned. Out of this crucible came a new kind of soldier, mechanic, navigator, and raider in one. Stirling wrote in his report to headquarters, "The parachute as a means of entry is ill-suited to desert conditions. Our future operations will rely on motor transport. The desert will provide both concealment and approach." He was, once again, breaking rules. But this time the rules were already crumbling. At Cabrit, the desert became their teacher. Engines coughed in the heat, gearboxes seized, and tempers flared, but day by day the men learned how to turn civilian machines into weapons. They carried spare fan belts made from old leather harness, greased rifle bolts with candle wax, and built shade with tarpaulins stretched over rifle barrels. A broken truck was not abandoned. It was stripped, shared, reborn in another chassis. The first combined exercise with the long-range desert group began in mid-December 1941. 3 LRDG patrols provided navigation, while Stirling's handful of raiders rode as passengers, each man carrying 8 pounds of explosives, 2 pistols, and one clear objective: destroy as many aircraft as possible on Axis airfields near Agadabia. They travelled at dusk, headlights covered with thin strips of gauze so that only a dull amber glow reached the sand. The wind dropped. The sound of engines carried for miles, so they drove in short bursts, halting every hour to listen. If nothing moved, they rolled on again. After 2 days they reached a dry wadi 20 miles south of their target. The LRDG patrols fanned out to scout water sources and escape tracks. Stirling ordered silence and rest until nightfall. The men slept beside their trucks, faces wrapped in scarves against the cold. When darkness returned, they began the final approach on foot, each pair carrying a bag of thermite bombs. Agadabia airfield appeared as a flat strip of darkness, punctuated by the faint glow of guard lights. At the signal, 3 flashes of a shuttered torch. The men moved in. They placed bombs on aircraft wheels, under engine cowlings, along fuel lines. One man counted 40 planes before he ran out of charges. The withdrawal was as silent as the entry. Minutes later, white light ripped through the night. Thermite burned at more than 2,000 degrees, cutting through metal like paper. Explosions followed as fuel ignited. When the first guards reached the runway, the raiders were already 10 miles away, climbing into their trucks. They drove south until the sun rose behind them, the desert glowing pink. Not one casualty. Headquarters later credited them with the destruction of more than 60 aircraft. It was the beginning of a legend. Encouraged, Stirling planned larger raids. Each success demanded longer travel, heavier fuel loads, and faster withdrawal. Mechanics at Cabrit modified the Chevrolets again: twin fuel tanks, weapon mounts, reinforced with scavenged aircraft struts, spare tires strapped to the bonnet. The men joked that they were building ghost ships for the sand sea. During one return journey, a sandstorm struck without warning. Visibility fell to 0. The horizon disappeared. Rather than stop, the LRDG navigators used the sound of the wind as compass, knowing that in that region it always blew from the northwest. They steered by ear for 8 hours until the storm cleared. When they emerged, they were exactly on course. It became part of the SAS's unwritten creed: trust the desert, learn its rhythm. By February 1942, Stirling had enough results to convince Middle East Command that his detachment should become permanent. The British Army was slow to believe, but photographs of wrecked German aircraft told their own story. Supplies were granted, more vehicles, more explosives, and a handful of new recruits. Among them was Paddy Mayne, a former Irish rugby international whose discipline and ferocity would soon define the unit's fighting spirit. Mayne saw at once that the raids could be improved. Instead of sneaking onto airfields on foot, why not mount the guns directly on the trucks and drive through at speed, spraying the parked aircraft with tracer? It was reckless, but effective. His first experiment destroyed another 20 aircraft at Matuba with minimal losses. The tactic became standard: hit fast, never linger, and disappear into the dunes. By now, German and Italian patrols were reporting mysterious convoys moving hundreds of miles from any known road. They called them Die Englischen Wüstenfahrer, the English desert drivers. Within months, those reports changed tone. Convoys were being annihilated, fuel dumps exploding without warning. Fear spread faster than intelligence. The Afrika Korps began referring to the attackers simply as Geister, ghosts. Back at Cabrit, Stirling expanded his camp into a small city of tents and workshops. Mechanics welded gun mounts late into the night. Armourers filled belts for the Vickers K guns. The noise of engines and hammers carried across the canal. There were no parades, no salutes, no brass. Only work. Each man customized his truck. Names painted on doors, mascots carved into dashboards, St. Christopher medals wired to the steering column. The machines became personal extensions of their crews. Fuel, water, ammunition, and friendship were shared with the same economy. Before each mission, Stirling gathered the men beneath the one surviving palm near camp. He spoke quietly, rarely more than a few sentences. "Remember, we are few, and they are many. We cannot outfight them, we can outthink them." Then engines roared, and the desert swallowed them once more. By the spring of 1942, the Special Air Service had evolved from an experiment into a precision instrument. The British press knew nothing of it. Officially, the unit did not exist. But in the diaries of Luftwaffe, ground crews appeared the same recurring phrase: Angriff in der Nacht, niemand gesehen. Attack in the night, no one seen. The ghosts of the dunes were real. The base at Cabrit grew like an organism. 1 week it was a scattering of tents beside the canal. A month later it was a factory. The sound of welding torches crackled through the dust haze, while men in oil-stained shorts hammered sheet metal into gun shields. Empty ration tins became funnels. Damaged engines became donors for the next raid. The long-range desert group had shown that a standard truck could cross impossible ground. The SAS turned the same truck into a weapon. Armour was useless, weight killed range, but firepower mattered. The solution was the Vickers K gun, an aircraft weapon normally used by RAF gunners. Each fired 1,200 rounds a minute. Two mounted side by side could chew through an aircraft in seconds. The guns were fixed on swivel posts so the gunners could sweep 180 degrees while standing in the rear compartment. Mayne insisted that every vehicle carry at least 4 guns, 2 forward, 2 aft. Ammunition drums lined the sides like metallic fruit, 48 rounds apiece, each labelled with chalk. The smell of gun oil mixed with petrol and desert wind. Fuel was the next problem. A standard Chevrolet carried 80 gallons, enough for barely 350 miles. A raid often required 800 or more. They fitted auxiliary tanks from crashed aircraft, connected by rubber hose and hand-pumped valves. When one tank ran dry, another was opened. The roar of the pump became a background rhythm to every journey. They learned to ration everything: 2 gallons of water per man per day, 10 ounces of food at noon, 1 cigarette after dark. Water was for engines before it was for men. If a truck boiled, the driver would pour from his own canteen without hesitation. Tyres wore out faster than they could be replaced. To cross soft dunes, they deflated them to 12 pounds pressure, rolling like boats over waves of sand. When a tyre shredded, it was replaced with whatever fitted, sometimes a German pattern, sometimes Italian. The trucks looked patchwork, but functioned like clockwork. They discovered that sound carried differently in the desert. During the day, heat bent noise upward. At night, cold air trapped it low. To move unheard, they idled engines and coasted down slopes, communicating with hand signals. Every man knew at least a dozen: stop, spread, danger, fuel, aircraft overhead. Their coordination was as exact as any drill parade, but performed in silence. By April 1942, they had built 20 full-equipped raiding trucks. Each had a name: Beelzebub, Black Maria, Hell's Angel, Preacher's Son. Some carried painted insignia of skulls or crossed wings. Others bore nothing but sand-polished paint. They were, in essence, extensions of their crews, mobile fortresses of 6 men and a storm of bullets. The men joked that their vehicles were half truck, half fever dream. In truth, they were masterpieces of improvisation. Nothing on them was standard issue. Stirling authorized it that way. "We fight the enemy, not the manual," he said. The next series of raids would test every improvement. Intelligence reports suggested that the Axis was using 3 main airstrips along the coast west of Benghazi. They were far beyond the reach of ordinary patrols, but the SAS was no longer ordinary. They moved out at dusk in 4 columns, 20 trucks in all. The LRDG navigated point, using the sun compass by day and stars by night. Behind them, the SAS followed like shadows. The journey lasted 4 days. Sandstorms came and went. One truck overturned, another lost a wheel. Yet the column pressed on. At night, the dunes glowed pale under the moon. The men drove without lights, following the silhouette of the truck ahead. To keep awake, they sang quietly or recited engine checks aloud. Conversation drifted between philosophy and nonsense. Who could strip a vicar's fastest? Which brand of bully beef was least inedible? Whether Rommel slept at night? On the 5th night, they reached the target area, a flat expanse broken by the faint lights of an airfield. Mayne ordered the trucks into attack formation, 2 abreast, guns ready, engines idling. He waited until the first flare of dawn touched the horizon, and then gave the order. The convoy burst from the darkness like a sandstorm. Twin Vickers guns hammered, their tracers weaving red ribbons through the air. Axis guards froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. British trucks driving straight through the heart of their base, cutting down anything that moved. Aircraft burned on their wheels. Fuel drums exploded. Ammunition dumps went up like bonfires. The whole attack lasted less than 10 minutes. As quickly as they came, the raiders turned south, driving flat out across open desert. Behind them, the airfield was a single sheet of flame. Axis patrols pursued for hours, guided by the column of smoke, but the trucks vanished into wadis the pursuers did not know existed. When they returned to Kabrit, the men looked half-starved, clothes in tatters, eyes rimmed with sand. They had destroyed more than 80 aircraft and lost not a single man. The desert had swallowed them and spat them out untouched. Word reached Cairo. What had begun as an unauthorized experiment was now essential. Supplies flowed freely, more volunteers arrived. Stirling received permission to expand his detachment into a regiment. Mayne began organizing permanent workshops for vehicle modification. Mechanics from the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers joined the camp, turning it into a legitimate base of operations. Every new truck improved on the last. Welders added brackets for additional fuel cans, pivot mounts for captured MG-34s, and racks for grenades. Wooden floors were replaced with steel mesh so that sand could fall through instead of collecting underfoot. Windshields were removed entirely, too reflective, too fragile. Drivers wore goggles and scarves instead. A man learned to read the terrain by vibration through the steering wheel. They experimented with camouflage paint, blending dull ochre with grey and pale blue to match the horizon line. From even 100 metres away, a truck parked among dunes seemed part of the landscape. When the sun was low, it disappeared entirely. In May 1942, they tested the modifications in an unprecedented deep desert journey to raid airfields near Tobruk. The drive would take them more than 1,000 miles round trip, the limit of what any machine had done in that theatre. Along the way, they left caches of fuel and water, marked with tiny piles of stones, so that the return path would not depend on luck. The raid was another success, but something deeper changed in its aftermath. The men began to talk of the desert with respect, almost reverence. They no longer felt like intruders, but inhabitants. "We don't fight in the desert," one driver wrote home. "We fight with it." By now, intelligence analysts in Berlin were reading field reports that made little sense. Convoys ambushed hundreds of kilometers from the nearest Allied position. Aircraft destroyed on supposedly secret strips. The only pattern was unpredictability. A captured Italian officer described the attackers as spirits who ride the wind. The name stuck. Inside the SAS camp, men began referring to themselves the same way. Ghosts of the dunes. They painted the words on ammo boxes and truck doors. It was half joke, half truth. None expected to live long. All intended to make their presence unforgettable. Kabrit was no longer a secret outpost. It had become a legend whispered along the Nile. Mechanics from the RAF came to learn how the SAS tuned engines for desert conditions. Naval officers visited to study fuel logistics. The camp resembled a junkyard, but from the wreckage rose one of the most efficient strike forces on Earth. In the workshop tents, the air shimmered with heat and the smell of scorched metal. Men worked bare-chested, welding goggles pushed high on their foreheads. A generator coughed in the background, driving a single electric lamp that illuminated sparks bouncing off steel. Each truck was stripped to its skeleton and rebuilt according to lessons from the last mission. Every addition came from experience written in blood or sweat. Sand shields to protect brake lines, extra brackets for water cans, dust filters scavenged from aircraft engines. They even modified the tires themselves. Standard rubber cracked under the constant heat, so mechanics cut slits along the treads, allowing the rubber to flex. It reduced speed, but doubled endurance. When supply shortages hit, they layered old tires inside new ones, producing what they called double skins. These improvisations kept trucks rolling where others sank. Weapons evolved too. The Vickers K remained their favourite, but captured German guns often proved superior in sustained fire. Crews became fluent in every weapon they might encounter. They carried spare barrels, grease pots, and canvas bags of mixed ammunition. British .303, German 7.92, Italian breeder rounds, all labelled and stored by instinct rather than regulation. Paddy Mayne pushed for heavier armament. He welded twin .50 caliber Brownings onto a truck christened the Widow. It shook itself nearly apart under recoil, but when aimed at parked aircraft, it was devastating. Another crew fitted a 20mm cannon scavenged from a downed Messerschmitt. They fired it once, decided it was too heavy, and used its recoil spring to build a new mounting for a lighter gun. Innovation never stopped. During evenings, the men gathered around petrol fires, faces flickering orange. They swapped advice about carburettor tuning and bullet trajectories, the way other soldiers traded gossip. A mechanic from Leeds taught his mates to use powdered milk as makeshift gasket sealant. A Rhodesian driver discovered that cutting strips from inner tubes made perfect silencers for jerrycan handles. Each trick was recorded in a battered notebook labelled Kabrit Modifications. That book would later influence vehicle design manuals long after the war. The Axis, meanwhile, began adapting. Rommel's intelligence officers established night patrols around key supply routes. Italian divisions set up dummy airfields to bait raiders. The Germans deployed armoured cars equipped with searchlights. None of it worked. The desert was too vast. The raiders too unpredictable. Even when patrols caught glimpses of them, pursuit was impossible. SAS trucks could outdistance armour by hundreds of miles. They ran on instinct rather than road. Still, the risk grew. During one raid near Bas, a German patrol intercepted part of the column. The gunfight lasted hours. 2 trucks were destroyed, 3 men killed. Survivors buried the dead in shallow graves marked by empty cartridges, then drove on to complete the mission. It was the cost of freedom to operate. Back at Cabrit, the losses were noted without ceremony. Stirling's philosophy was clear: learn, adapt, continue. A new truck was built to replace each one lost. The names of the fallen were painted in small letters along the doors of surviving vehicles, a quiet roll of honour that grew with each month. By late summer of 1942, the Desert War itself had shifted. Rommel's forces advanced toward El Alamein, and the British Eighth Army prepared for the decisive battle that would decide North Africa's fate. For the SAS, the coming campaign offered opportunity and danger. Their raids were now vital to the overall strategy. Every plane destroyed on the ground, every fuel convoy burned, weakened the Axis before the clash. Stirling split his regiment into smaller units operating simultaneously. Mayne led one, Bill Fraser another, with LRDG patrols providing distant support. Radio contact was minimal. Each commander carried sealed maps and relied on timing rather than orders. Coordination came from trust and routine. If you weren't back by the appointed date, the desert buried your secret. One night in September, Mayne's unit hit an airfield near Benghazi during a sandstorm. Visibility was so poor that guards sheltered in hangars, assuming no one could navigate in such conditions. The raiders drove straight through the haze, guided by compass alone, guns blazing at silhouettes. When the storm cleared, the entire Luftwaffe detachment lay in ruins. They destroyed 30 aircraft and escaped without loss. The Germans later called it the invisible attack. That same month, Stirling received a visitor from London, Major General Ritchie himself, the man whose office he had once invaded to pitch his wild idea. Ritchie toured the camp, listened to mechanics describing their modifications, and watched a demonstration of how a truck could be field repaired in under 20 minutes. By the end, he was convinced. He authorized full regimental status and expanded funding. The SAS was no longer unofficial. It was now part of Britain's strategic order of battle. Recognition changed little on the ground. The men still slept under trucks, still shaved with cold engine oil, still measured success in destroyed aircraft rather than commendations. But it meant they could plan bigger operations. The largest came in October 1942, on the eve of El Alamein. Intelligence suggested that Rommel's supply convoys were bottlenecked at the port of Benghazi. Stirling proposed a simultaneous strike on the port facilities and the nearby airfields, crippling the Axis ability to reinforce during the main battle. Approval arrived from Cairo with a single line: "Proceed at your discretion." Preparations took 2 weeks. Fuel and ammunition were cached along the route. The trucks were loaded until springs groaned. Each man wrote a brief letter home, sealed it, and handed it to the quartermaster. If he returned, it would be returned unopened. If not, it would be mailed. The column left Cabrit under a half-moon. 90 men, 24 vehicles. They drove west for days, following old caravan routes through dunes that shifted like liquid. They passed wrecks half buried in sand, Italian lorries, downed aircraft, the skeletal remains of past expeditions. Nothing slowed them. Stirling rode near the front, scanning the horizon with field glasses, his scarf pulled high against the wind. On the 7th night, they struck Benghazi's southern airfield. The attack was flawless. 20 minutes of gunfire, 30 aircraft destroyed, then withdrawal southward before dawn. But, as they regrouped, A fuel truck struck a buried mine. The explosion lit the desert. Axis patrols converged. A running battle ensued across the dunes. One truck after another fell behind, riddled with bullets. Stirling ordered the survivors to scatter and reassemble at a prearranged wadi 50 miles away. For 2 days they hid by day and moved by night, avoiding search aircraft. By the time they returned to friendly lines, half the vehicles were gone. Yet the mission's effect was enormous. Luftwaffe operations over El Alamein dropped sharply in the following week. The Eighth Army gained air superiority and launched its final offensive. Victory in North Africa began with burning wings on a distant airstrip. When the battle ended, the SAS men heard the news through crackling radio. Rommel was retreating. They had done their part, though few would ever be named. In war diaries, the official entry was brief. Special raiding forces successful. Casualties moderate. For those who lived it, that line contained a lifetime. After El Alamein, the desert changed character. Where once the war had been a static struggle along the coast, now it became pursuit. Rommel's army was broken, retreating west through Libya with the British and Commonwealth forces on its heels. For the SAS, victory meant freedom to range deeper than ever before. Stirling watched the Axis collapse from the seat of a battered Chevrolet. The dunes around him were littered with the debris of war. Burnt fuel cans, broken rifles, shoes half buried in sand. Each item told the same story, a retreating army shedding weight to survive. It was the perfect hunting ground for his raiders. The regiment now numbered several hundred men, divided into patrols named for their commanders, Mayne, Fraser, Tonkin, and others. Each patrol carried the same credo, mobility above all. They would chase the retreat across 2,000 kilometers of desert, harassing supply lines, cutting telegraph wires, and striking convoys that thought themselves safe behind the front. Headquarters in Cairo gave only the broadest orders. The SAS was expected to harass, delay, and disorganize the enemy withdrawal. How that was done was left entirely to the men who knew the desert best. At first, the Axis columns still moved by road, shadowed by Allied air reconnaissance. But as bridges fell and fuel dwindled, the Germans and Italians began using old caravan tracks through open sand to avoid air attack. Those tracks were the domain of the SAS. Within days, convoys began to disappear. A fuel column would leave Agadir at dusk and simply not arrive. The next morning, smoke would be visible on the horizon, black towers marking another ambush. Each time recovery teams found the same signature: burned-out trucks, German helmets scattered in the sand, and Vickers shell casings stamped with British markings. What they could not find were the attackers. Even when patrols closed the gap, the raiders melted away, leaving tire tracks that vanished in wind. One Italian survivor described them as men who rode with the storm. The myth of the ghost trucks grew stronger with every vanished convoy. At Cabrit, Stirling's headquarters was now a hub of constant motion. Dispatch riders came and went, bringing scraps of intelligence, intercepted radio messages, aerial photographs, rumours from captured drivers. Stirling rarely slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. He spent nights hunched over maps, drawing routes in pencil, erasing them, redrawing them again. He had begun to think like the enemy, predicting where Rommel's logistics officers would attempt their next line of supply, and planning to be there first. Every few weeks, the regiment re-equipped. Trucks that had survived multiple raids were retired, stripped for parts, and rebuilt. Their metal was fatigued, their engines tired, but the crews refused to scrap them completely. They believed that luck adhered to machinery. Some insisted on keeping a fragment of their old vehicle, a door handle, a rear-view mirror, as a talisman for the next. Paddy Mayne, now Stirling's right hand, turned the raiding doctrine into an art. He taught his men that movement itself was camouflage. During the day, a stationary truck drew the eye. A moving one vanished in heat haze. they began travelling in single-file columns that mimicked the natural patterns of wind-blown sand ridges, blending with the landscape. When aircraft appeared overhead, the column froze, and men covered windscreens with canvas until the plane passed. Pilots reported seeing nothing but dunes. Each patrol operated as a self-contained organism: driver, gunner, navigator, fitter, and commander. Rank meant little once they left camp. Decisions were made by whoever saw the danger first. Trust replaced hierarchy. Survival depended on it. A wrong bearing could mean death by thirst within a day. They learned to read the desert's language, how the colour of sand revealed moisture below, how the flight of a single crow could indicate a distant waterhole. A thin haze on the horizon meant soft ground ahead. Rippling air meant hard pan. To outsiders, it looked like instinct. To them, it was the result of endless observation. In December 1942, as Rommel's rearguard fought at Buerat, Stirling launched his most daring operation yet, a deep penetration strike on the main Axis supply route between Tripoli and Sirte. The plan was to hit 3 convoys in quick succession, forcing the Germans to divert entire battalions to guard their rear. The column set out with 30 trucks and an escort of LRDG vehicles. For 2 days they saw nothing but wind and dust. On the 3rd, they sighted a string of lorries winding through the low passes near Wadan. The convoy included tankers, liquid gold in the desert. The ambush began with a single burst from a hidden Vickers K. The first tanker exploded, blocking the road. Within seconds, the rest of the trucks were in flames. The raiders struck from both sides, cutting down defenders before they could man their machine guns. Within 10 minutes, the convoy was gone. A second attack followed 20 miles west, another 30 miles beyond that. The pattern was deliberate, a moving front of destruction that travelled faster than news could reach headquarters. By the time Axis Command realised what was happening, their transport network was paralysed. Supply convoys halted, fearing unseen enemies. Fuel dumps were emptied to prevent capture, leaving tanks stranded. The Afrika Korps' fighting power drained away not through battle, but through the invisible pressure of raids. When reports finally reached Rommel's staff, they estimated that motorised British saboteurs had destroyed over 200 vehicles in a fortnight. They could not grasp that the same handful of men were responsible for all of it. The ghost trucks were everywhere and nowhere. As winter cooled the desert, the SAS pushed westward into territory once thought unreachable. They raided Sirte, Wadan, and Hun. They struck along the coastal road to Tripoli. At each stop they found evidence of panic: abandoned fuel drums, aircraft dismantled to prevent capture, trenches dug in random directions. The psychological effect exceeded the physical damage. One Italian colonel, captured after his convoy was ambushed, asked his interrogator, "How many of these ghost men do you have?" When told the truth, barely 200, he refused to believe it. Back in Cairo, Allied intelligence analysts studied the raids and saw a glimpse of future warfare. Small, mobile units striking deep into enemy territory, guided by intelligence rather than mass. The term Special Forces began appearing in official memoranda for the first time. For Stirling and his men, none of that mattered. They were too busy surviving. The desert gave victory, but took its price. Typhus, dysentery, and exhaustion stalked the camp. Trucks wore out faster than replacements could arrive. Yet morale remained unbroken. They believed they were part of something new, an experiment proving itself with each mile of sand. In January 1943, as Allied armies closed on Tripoli, Stirling prepared one last great strike before the Axis were driven into Tunisia. It would take him deeper than he had ever gone, nearly 1,800 kilometres behind the front, into territory still controlled by German rearguards. Success could shatter Rommel's retreat. Failure would mean annihilation. He gathered his officers under a tattered awning at Kabrit and spread a map across the bonnet of his truck, The plan was simple. 3 groups would depart separately, each attacking a key junction on the main coastal road, then rendezvous at a dry wadi north of Sabha. Timing would be everything. Before dawn, the trucks rolled out. Engines muttered low, sand rising behind them like smoke. Stirling rode in the lead vehicle, his face half-masked by scarf and goggles, the desert reflected in his lenses. He had led dozens of raids, but this one felt different, final somehow. They reached the first junction at nightfall on the 3rd day. Axis vehicles moved in single file along the narrow causeway, headlights dimmed. The ambush erupted in the usual flash of tracers and explosions, but this time the response came swiftly. The Germans had learned. Within minutes, mortars were firing blindly into the darkness. Shells burst among the dunes, shattering 2 trucks. Stirling ordered a withdrawal south, unaware that radio intercepts had already pinpointed his direction. At dawn, a column of German armoured cars moved to cut them off. For the first time in months, the hunters were hunted. The chase stretched across 50 miles of open sand. One by one, the raiding trucks ran out of fuel or were hit. Stirling's own vehicle was disabled by machine gun fire. He and his driver fled on foot, hiding among low dunes until nightfall. They were captured the next morning. When news reached Cabrit, silence fell across the camp. The man who had invented their way of war was gone. Command passed to Paddy Mayne, who simply said, "We keep going." Within hours, patrols were back on the move. Paddy Mayne inherited command the way a man picks up a rifle that's still hot from firing. There was no ceremony, no letter of appointment. Stirling was a prisoner somewhere in Europe, and the regiment still had work to do. Mayne simply climbed onto the bonnet of a truck, told the men that nothing changed, and ordered them to load ammunition. He was unlike any officer the British Army had ever produced, a former rugby international from County Down, brilliant and volatile, equally capable of poetry and fury. He believed discipline came from competence, not parade ground ritual. If a man could keep his truck running, shoot straight, and bring his patrol home, that was all the discipline Mayne required. His first act was to move the headquarters forward. Cabrit was too far behind the lines. The desert war had shifted into Tunisia, where rocky ridges replaced open sand, and Axis rearguards fought like cornered animals. Mayne established a new base near Tripoli, close enough for supply, but remote enough for secrecy. Here the regiment rebuilt, new trucks, new recruits, and a new purpose. The war in Tunisia was different. The dunes gave way to broken plains cut by dry riverbeds. Ambushes came from above rather than from the horizon. Yet Mayne saw possibilities. The enemy believed the SAS were confined to open desert. No one expected them to appear in the hills. He decided to adapt. Mechanics fitted wider tyres and reinforced suspension. They stripped every ounce of weight from the jeeps until they could climb rock slopes that seemed impossible. These modified vehicles carried twin Vickers K guns and racks of grenades, smaller, faster, deadlier than the old Chevrolets. They became an extension of Mayne's personality, quick, aggressive, unpredictable. He led from the front. On the first raid under his command, he personally drove the lead jeep through a German encampment near Kasserine, firing both guns while his driver steered with one hand. The camp erupted in panic. Tents collapsed, trucks burned. When the shooting stopped, 25 enemy vehicles were destroyed. Mayne returned to base without a scratch, grinning beneath dust-blackened goggles. The men followed him without question from then on. Under Mayne, the SAS changed from surgical raiders into relentless pursuers. They no longer waited for orders or perfect conditions. When intelligence hinted at movement, they struck. One patrol could hit 3 convoys in a night, vanish into the hills, and reappear 100 miles away before dawn. Axis radio traffic filled with frantic reports of British bandits in trucks. The Germans answered with patrols of their own, armoured cars mounting 20mm cannons. The SAS fought them like wolves circling bears, darting in and out of range, drawing fire until the heavier vehicles bogged down. Then the jeeps would swarm, emptying magazines into radiators and tyres, vanishing again before retaliation could come. Losses mounted on both sides. Each engagement was brutal and close. But Mayne believed momentum was life, stopping meant death. When men broke down from exhaustion, he gave them whiskey and sent them back out. "The war won't wait for sleep," he said. To outsiders it looked reckless. To his men it felt like freedom. As the Allies closed on the Mareth line, the SAS became the sharp edge of pursuit. They raided depots, seized maps, captured prisoners who spoke of chaos behind the Axis front. Even General Montgomery, never quick to praise irregulars, admitted that Mayne's raiders had saved thousands of British lives by destroying enemy fuel before it reached the battlefield. The cost was heavy. Of the original veterans from Cabrit, fewer than a third remained. Sun, stress and combat had burned them down to bone and nerve. Yet morale held. Each new recruit was taught the same unspoken law: no medals, no recognition, only results. When a patrol returned, the only question Mayne asked was, "Did it work?" In April 1943, the SAS launched its final desert operation of the African campaign. The objective was to destroy the retreating columns heading toward Cape Bon. The raid lasted 3 days, covering almost 500 miles of hostile territory. They struck convoys, blew up dumps, and fought skirmishes at point-blank range. When they finally withdrew, Mayne's column counted more than 100 vehicles destroyed. It was his masterpiece, and his farewell to the desert. A week later, Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. For the first time in 2 years, the guns fell silent. The men of the SAS stood beside their trucks and looked across the dunes that had been their home. The wind carried the same dry whisper it always had. They knew they would never fight a war like this again. The regiment was ordered north to train for operations in Europe. The desert ghosts would trade sand for hedgerows, open sky for forests. They dismantled their trucks one last time, salvaging parts, burning what could not be moved. Before leaving, Mayne gathered the surviving veterans. He told them that the desert had made them what they were: self-reliant, fearless, unbreakable, and that whatever came next, those lessons would keep them alive. That night, as they boarded transport ships bound for Sicily, the horizon behind them glowed faintly where abandoned fuel stores burned. The ghosts were leaving their kingdom. The desert ended at the water's edge. From the docks at Tripoli, the Mediterranean stretched out like polished steel, calm and deceptive. The men stood on the pier watching their battered jeeps lifted into the holds of landing ships, the same machines that had carried them through every mile of sand, now dangling above salt water. No one spoke much. Leaving the desert felt like leaving a living thing. Paddy Mayne paced the quay, issuing orders in his low, clipped voice. He hated ceremonies, so there was none. The regiment that had begun as Stirling's band of misfits was now a formal part of the 8th Army Order of Battle, recognised, equipped, and bound for Europe. Their new task: prepare for the invasion of Sicily and, beyond it, Italy. The change of theatre meant more than geography. It meant a new kind of war. In North Africa, the desert had been their ally. Open ground gave freedom, surprise, and endless space to vanish. Europe would be the opposite: mountains, villages, roads, civilians. The men wondered whether their ghost tactics could survive among trees and stone. Mayne told them it would, because the principles were the same: mobility, intelligence, surprise. The only difference was terrain. The voyage north took 3 days. At dawn, the ships anchored off the Sicilian coast. The sky glowed orange. Waves slapped against steel hulls. Mayne watched landing craft lowering into the water and said quietly, "Back to soldiering." Then he climbed down the rope ladder and stepped aboard the first craft himself. They landed under air cover near Gela, ahead of the main American landings. The SAS jeeps rolled onto the beach and fanned inland through olive groves, engines snarling. Dust replaced sand, but the rhythm was the same: move, strike, vanish. They targeted airfields and communication posts, repeating the pattern that had broken Rommel's supply lines. Within 48 hours they had destroyed several aircraft on the ground and blown 2 bridges feeding German reinforcements toward the coast. What surprised them most was how easily the tactics translated. The same night raids, the same reliance on speed and confusion, worked just as well against columns confined to narrow mountain roads as they had on desert tracks. The Germans had learned to fear them in Africa. Now they feared them in Europe. Intercepted radio messages referred to English commandos with jeeps appearing from nowhere. It was a new landscape for an old legend. The Sicilian campaign lasted 6 weeks. By its end, the SAS had earned an unofficial reputation as the Army's most reliable chaos makers. Mayne's men destroyed convoys, sabotaged rail lines, and guided paratroopers through terrain too rough for maps. They worked with local partisans who taught them hidden mule paths through the hills. In return, the British shared rations and medical supplies. Bonds formed that would outlast the war. When Sicily fell, orders came for the regiment to move again, this time to southern Italy. The transition from dust to mud was abrupt. Rains turned roads into rivers. Engines that had never known cold began to seize. The desert trucks were modified once more, fitted with new filters to handle damp air, chains on tires, and camouflage nets of brown and green instead of sand. They were still the same vehicles underneath, still the ghosts that refused to die. In Italy, the raids grew more complex. The enemy had retreated into mountains, building defensive lines anchored by concrete bunkers. Surprise now depended on silence rather than speed. SAS patrols left their jeeps at the foot of hills and climbed on foot, carrying explosives in canvas bags. They moved at night, guided by shepherds and moonlight, cutting telephone wires, marking targets for Allied artillery. When pursuit grew too close, they melted into villages disguised as labourers. More than once, Italian civilians hid them from German patrols at the risk of execution. The fighting in Italy forged another transformation. The SAS were no longer just raiders, they were becoming a network. Mayne divided the regiment into small sections, capable of operating independently for weeks. They carried compact radios, learned local dialects, and trained with partisans. In mountain warfare, they rediscovered what they had once known in the desert, that knowledge and adaptability mattered more than numbers. A single jeep team could cripple an entire supply route if it chose the right moment. Through the winter of 1943 to 44, they fought almost unseen. Raids became routine. Reports of their actions appeared only as vague notes in divisional diaries. Enemy supply route disrupted, bridge destroyed overnight, unknown patrol sighted near lines. The men joked that they had become ghosts again, this time among the trees. Mayne himself grew quieter as the war ground on. The loss of Stirling still haunted him, though he rarely spoke of it. At night he read letters from the families of men who had not returned, then folded them away and went back to work. Leadership had hardened him, but never dulled his precision. He could still strip and reassemble a Vickers gun in total darkness, still navigate by the smell of the wind. The younger recruits treated him like a legend, though he refused to be called anything but Pat. By spring 1944, the regiment was preparing for another leap, the invasion of Normandy. For security reasons, few details reached them, but rumours were enough. They knew the war was moving toward its climax, and they would be there. Trucks were re-equipped once more. Extra radios, waterproofed engines, special mountings for jerrycans and spare wheels. Many of the original desert vehicles were now ghosts themselves. rebuilt 3 or 4 times over, the same frames carrying new scars. Before they sailed, Mayne assembled the regiment in a muddy field near Brindisi. He told them that whatever came next would be harder than anything they had done in the desert or the mountains, but that the same rules applied. Speed, surprise, intelligence. Nothing else wins a war. Then he dismissed them with a wave of his hand and went back to checking engines. When the invasion of Normandy began on the 6th of June 1944, elements of the SAS were already behind enemy lines. Parachuted into occupied France weeks earlier, they operated under code names that hid their origin. Teams with names like Hounsworth, Bullbasket and Luyton. Their jeeps were airdropped in sections, reassembled under fire and used to strike convoys on the roads to the beaches. Once again, the Ghosts had gone ahead of the army. Their task was to disrupt reinforcements moving toward the coast. They ambushed columns, destroyed bridges, and guided local resistance fighters. German commanders complained that every road behind the front had become a battlefield without soldiers. The same pattern repeated: attack at night, vanish by dawn. What had begun in sandstorms was now playing out in hedgerows. As the Allies advanced through France, the SAS spread like mercury. Patrols appeared hundreds of kilometres apart, always just where the Germans were weakest. They used intelligence gathered by the French resistance and RAF reconnaissance to strike fuel depots and communication hubs. In some regions, they liberated entire towns before regular units arrived. The people called them the Ghost Liberators, mistaking their insignia for skulls in the dark. For the men who had fought in Africa, Europe felt claustrophobic. The horizon was gone. Every sound echoed off walls. But they adapted, just as they always had. They learned to drive their jeeps through narrow lanes, to hide them under haystacks, to fight ambushes among stone barns instead of dunes. What mattered was not where they fought, but how. By the autumn of 1944, the SAS had become an integral part of the Allied advance. They fought in France, Belgium and Holland, cutting communications ahead of the main armies. Their losses were heavy, but so were the results. Every destroyed train or convoy shortened the war, and everywhere they went, their reputation preceded them. German prisoners spoke of shadow columns that moved without sound, of trucks that appeared in the night and were gone by morning. The ghost legend had crossed another sea. By winter of 1944, the SAS were ghosts in name only. They were everywhere, France, Belgium, Holland, even pushing toward the Rhine, but they still fought as they had in the desert, small, independent, and mercilessly efficient. Their jeeps were patched with bullet holes, their engines sounding like old animals growling in their sleep, but they never stopped moving. The war had changed. The Germans were retreating now, not because of defeat in one battle, but because the supply chain that held their armies together had been shattered from within. Rail lines, bridges, convoys, all had been methodically destroyed by the men who once rode dunes under a blood-red sun. The pattern was as elegant as it was deadly. Conventional armies attacked from the front. The SAS cut the veins behind it. Each patrol operated with precision, bordering on instinct. One moment they were hidden among trees, the next they burst from cover. Twin Vickers guns spitting light and thunder. By the time the echo faded, the enemy's fuel and ammunition were gone, and with them the will to fight. What distinguished the SAS from every other unit was not technology or numbers, but a philosophy forged in the desert, the belief that initiative outweighed hierarchy. Orders were guidelines, not shackles. Each man was expected to think, decide and act as if the entire war depended on him, because sometimes it did. In the autumn of 1944, Mayne received a new assignment: operate deep in occupied Holland, striking German lines of communication ahead of Montgomery's advance. It was a mission that would test every lesson learned since Cabrit. The terrain was marshy, crisscrossed by canals and dikes, the antithesis of desert warfare. Yet Mayne looked at the map and said, "It's all the same once you move faster than they can think." They went in under cloud and rain. Their jeeps churned mud instead of sand, but the principles held: surprise, speed, confusion. Villagers woke at dawn to see columns of German trucks burning on the causeways, their drivers gone, their escorts scattered. To the locals, it was as if ghosts had passed through during the night. The raids in Holland were some of the most dangerous of the entire war. German patrols were everywhere, and escape routes were limited. When ambushed, the SAS fought like cornered animals, fast, brutal, decisive. There was no surrender. Capture meant execution. Many died in silence so that others could withdraw. For every man lost, 10 more volunteered to join. The legend had become its own recruiter. In December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge erupted, Mayne's jeeps were among the few Allied units capable of cutting through the chaos. They raided behind the German spearheads, attacking supply convoys in snow and darkness. Men who had once sweltered in 50-degree heat now fought in freezing blizzards, their engines coughing through frost, their faces rimmed with ice. They adapted without complaint. One veteran wrote, "It doesn't matter where you fight when you already live outside the map." By early 1945, the SAS had become an army within an army, small in number, immense in influence. Their raids shaped entire campaigns. Their intelligence guided major offensives, and as the Allied armies crossed the Rhine, the ghosts followed, sweeping through the ruins of the Reich. They liberated prisoners, captured documents, dismantled what remained of the German command network. On May 8, 1945, when the war in Europe ended, many of them were still on the move, unaware that the fighting was over. When the message reached them, they did not cheer. They simply stopped, shut down their engines, and listened to the silence. For the first time in years, the desert, or the echo of it, was quiet. Some of the jeeps were abandoned where they stood. Others were loaded onto transport ships again, bound for home. The men returned to a Britain that hardly knew what to do with them. There were no parades, no uniforms pressed for inspection. Officially, they were disbanded, their exploits scattered across classified reports and whispers. But the legend was already out of their control. The lessons of the SAS, flexibility, intelligence, courage in small units, spread through every army that studied the war. In France, the commandos; in America, the Green Berets; in Germany itself, the KSK. All traced their lineage, knowingly or not, back to the ghosts of the desert who had shown what mobility and will could achieve against empire and order. For Mayne, peace was never easy. He returned to Ireland a hero few recognised. His war had been too unorthodox for medals, too effective to ignore. He lived quietly, haunted by the memory of comrades buried in sand and snow. In his diary, he wrote one final line that could have been an epitaph for them all. "We went to the edge of the map and found that it moved with us." The SS would be reborn a few years later, reconstituted in the shadows of another world dividing itself between East and West. But the foundation was already laid. Every covert strike, every special mission, every modern operation that values intelligence over mass and daring over numbers carries the imprint of those early days. From the dunes of North Africa to the forests of Europe, they changed the grammar of war. They proved that technology alone does not define an army. Imagination does. The trucks they built in sand and sweat became symbols of a philosophy that would outlive them, that no machine is greater than the man who drives it into the unknown. When the guns fell silent, the machines that had carried the ghosts began their second life, not in battlefields, but in memory. What had started as a handful of desert trucks became relics of something larger, a new idea of warfare, and of human ingenuity itself. Across Britain, museums collected the survivors. Mechanics who had once worked at Cambridge now stood under electric lights in workshops at Bovington and Duxford, carefully restoring vehicles they had driven into hell. They were astonished by what they found in the details: makeshift repairs that had become permanent design features, fuel lines rerouted with copper tubing, mounts for Vickers guns built from aircraft brackets, the skeletal frames of seats welded from scavenged exhausts. Each truck was both museum and machine, a record of adaptation written in steel. Historians came to call them the first mobile laboratories of irregular warfare. Before drones and satellites, before digital maps, these men had built their own answers out of what lay around them. Every bolt and weld had been made by necessity, and every necessity had changed how armies thought about movement, logistics, and autonomy. In 1946, an officer from the War Office walked through a hangar filled with SAS vehicles waiting for scrap. He saw the stripped jeeps and sun-bleached insignia and wrote in his notebook, "These are not trucks. They are ideas made visible." Within months, those ideas would reappear under new names: the long-range reconnaissance units of post-war Europe, the Israeli Palmach strike teams, the American Special Forces born from the Office of Strategic Services. Each claimed their own lineage, but the DNA was unmistakable. The men themselves scattered. Some returned to farms or factories, unable to describe what they had lived through. Others stayed in uniform, training new generations for conflicts that would erupt from Korea to the Middle East. A few, restless, addicted to motion, took to exploration, crossing the same deserts they once raided, this time with cameras instead of guns. They said it felt quieter, but never truly peaceful. The desert kept its secrets. At dawn, Bedouin travellers still found the rusted hulks of trucks half buried in sand, their tyres petrified, their gun mounts eaten away by wind. Sometimes they found bones beside them. Time erased names, but not purpose. Those machines had outlasted empires. In Britain, the legend of the SAS began to grow, first whispered, then written. War correspondents pieced together fragments of missions that had once been classified. Children in post-war classrooms read stories of men who rode the dunes like spirits. Films romanticized their raids. Writers cast them as knights of the mechanized age. Yet the truth was more human. Engineers, farmers, mechanics, and dreamers, bound by the idea that intelligence and improvisation could overturn any empire. The technology they used was primitive by modern standards: canvas, steel, petrol, and courage, but in their hands it became something transcendent. A desert truck that could travel 1,000 miles without supply lines was more revolutionary than any secret weapon of the age. It was a symbol of freedom in motion, proof that war could be waged not through overwhelming force, but through the will to think differently. When the Cold War dawned, the SAS was reborn officially, its structure formalized, its motto adopted: "Who dares wins." Behind that motto lay the ghost of every truck that had rolled across the Libyan dunes. The phrase captured what the desert had taught: that daring was a form of engineering, the courage to test a design against chaos and trust it to hold. As technology advanced, the essence remained. The helicopters of Vietnam, the Land Rovers of Oman, the special operations of Iraq and Afghanistan all carried the same ghost within their rotors and wheels. Modern commandos called it heritage. The veterans called it memory. Both were right. The last surviving desert raiders grew old in silence. Each year, fewer came to reunions. Those who did would find themselves standing beside restored jeeps, running their hands along the metal like archaeologists of their own lives. They would tell the young curators stories that seemed impossible, of nights when the sand burned red, of convoys vanishing under starlight. And when asked how it felt, they all said the same thing. It wasn't courage. It was work that needed doing. In the modern age of satellites and drones, when war has become invisible and remote, the image of those open trucks thundering through the desert still carries weight. They remind us that machinery is only as powerful as the imagination behind it, that even the simplest engine, placed in the hands of people who refuse to accept limits, can rewrite the map of history. If you stand today at Ardfert in County Kerry, where a memorial stone bears the names of the first SAS men lost in North Africa, you can hear the wind off the Atlantic echo faintly through the dunes. It sounds like engines, faint, distant, eternal. The ghosts never left. They simply traded desert for time. The world moved on, but the desert ghosts stayed in its circuitry. Every new machine of war, from jet fighter to satellite-guided drone, carries a trace of that original philosophy: freedom through adaptability, precision born from improvisation. In the age of data and automation, the spirit of the SAS lives inside the algorithms that think for themselves, the unmanned craft that strike and vanish. Each is a mechanical descendant of the trucks that once hunted convoys across endless sand. But what made the SAS truly different was not their hardware, it was their mind. They turned scarcity into strength, chaos into advantage. Their trucks were tools of necessity, fragile, patched, loud, yet they achieved what empires could not. They made technology human again. Every gear turned by hand, every route decided by thought. In that simplicity lay an elegance that the digital age still envies. After the war, engineers studied the patterns of their operations. They found lessons that transcended the battlefield: the mathematics of logistics, the psychology of uncertainty, the value of decentralized command. Factories applied those principles to production. Companies used them to map global supply chains. What had begun as a method of survival became a model for efficiency. The ghost trucks had reshaped not only war, but industry. The soldiers themselves never claimed to be inventors of a new world. They saw themselves as craftsmen, working with metal and sand to solve problems. Yet in doing so, they had created the blueprint for the modern war machine, a system built on speed, intelligence, and autonomy. Every tank, aircraft, and vehicle that followed carried some of their DNA. Even the computers that would one day guide missiles inherited the same logic of independence that once guided a driver by starlight. In Hereford, where the regiment was reborn, the memorial garden holds a simple bronze plaque: "Who dares wins." No ranks, no units, no decoration. Just the phrase that became a compass for generations. Visitors leave small tokens: model jeeps, photographs, sand from North Africa sealed in glass. To them, those machines were not relics, but reminders that courage is mechanical as much as moral, the motion of will through steel. At Bovington, one of the original Chevrolets sits under soft light. Its body is rusted, tires cracked, paint faded to the colour of old parchment. But if you lean close, you can still smell oil and dust. A tag on the dashboard reads simply, "Carbrit, 1942. It looks inert, but in its silence you can hear the echo of an engine starting somewhere beyond the horizon. Every generation finds its own desert. For some it is literal, sand and heat and emptiness. For others, it is the unknown frontier of science or space. The lesson remains the same. Progress begins when someone dares to move without a map. The men who became the ghosts of the dunes did not set out to be legends. They set out to make something work: a truck, a plan, a way through the impossible. Their victory was not in destruction, but in design. They proved that imagination could turn even a common machine into an instrument of destiny. In the long lineage of war, few inventions have carried such quiet power. From the chariots of the pharaohs to the tanks of the 20th century, every era has built its champions. But none embodied the paradox of strength and fragility as perfectly as those desert trucks, lightweight, underarmed, manned by volunteers who had no certainty of return. They were, and remain, the most human of war machines. Stand in the desert where the sand still hides their bones, and you might see the shimmer of sunlight on old metal. It could be heat haze, or the reflection of something enduring. Because the ghosts never truly vanished. They simply merged with the horizon, waiting for the next generation to remember that courage is a design, and freedom a machine built by hand.